Eleanor Whitmore took the letter, walked to the fireplace, and held it over the flame. Then she stopped. Because burning it meant Margaret won before the game even started. She pulled it back, pressed it flat against her chest, turned around and looked her stepmother dead in the eyes, across that beautiful dining room. The dining room built with her father's money, furnished with her father's taste, now belonging entirely to a woman who had spent 4 years trying to erase every trace of him that still lived in Eleanor's face. "I'll go," Eleanor said. "Gladly." Margaret's smile didn't waver. That was the worst part. If you've ever been handed a punishment dressed up as an opportunity, stay with me. Subscribe to this channel. Follow Eleanor's story all the way to the end, and drop a comment right now telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. The carriage hit a rut, and Eleanor's shoulder slammed into the wall hard enough to bruise. She didn't make a sound. 14 miles of summer road between Richmond and the Caldwell estate. The July heat sitting on the Virginia countryside, like something with weight and intention. And Eleanor had spent every one of those miles with the sealed letter pressed flat between her palms and her eyes fixed on nothing in particular outside the curtain. She knew what the letter said, not because she had opened it. The red wax seal was still intact, pressed with Margaret's family crest, a detail Margaret had chosen specifically because Eleanor's father's family had never bothered with a crest, but because Margaret had told her. Not in so many words. Margaret never operated in so many words. She operated in implications, in pauses, in the specific variety of smile she had worn this morning, standing at the top of the staircase, while Eleanor carried her own trunk to the front door. "You always said you wanted more for yourself, Eleanor. Now you'll have your chance." Clara and Bess had been in the hallway. Clara with her hand over her mouth. Bess not bothering. Eleanor had looked at them one at a time. She had picked up her trunk. She had walked out. The letter was addressed to Nathaniel Caldwell. That name alone was enough to explain the shape of what Margaret had done. Caldwell was not a man Richmond society discussed lightly. He was discussed the way people discussed a difficult winter, with resigned certainty, no expectation of warmth. He had come back from the war in 1814 with a limp and a reputation for impatience that had only sharpened in the 6 years since. He had bought up 3 neighboring estates whose owners had gone under, turned them into working land, and then refused every dinner invitation, every charitable introduction, and every well-meaning social gesture that Virginia's upper class had extended in his direction. "He's not uncivilized." Eleanor had once heard one of Margaret's friends say in the parlor, not knowing Eleanor was in the next room. "He's worse. He's simply indifferent." The carriage stopped. The driver climbed down without a word and set Eleanor's trunk in the dust. "This is as far as I go, miss." She stepped out without his help. The estate spread out in front of her large working, nothing soft about it. No flower beds, no trimmed hedges. The wood of the house was dark with age, and the windows were clean, and somewhere to the east behind the barn, men were calling to each other across the field, in the ordinary voices of people doing ordinary work on an ordinary summer morning. Nobody came out to meet her. She looked at the sealed letter. She thought about what Margaret had written inside it. She had not yet decided if she was angry, or something past anger, something quieter and more durable. She walked to the front door and knocked. The man who answered had a face like settled weather, 60 years of forming opinions about most things, and having been proven right about enough of them to stop apologizing for it. He looked at her trunk, then at her, then at the dust on her shoes. "Mr. Caldwell doesn't receive visitors," he said, and began to close the door. Eleanor put her hand on it. Not hard, but final. "I am not a visitor," she said. "I am the message that was sent. Give him this." She held out the letter. He looked at it. He looked at her. He took it. The door closed. She stood on the step and listened to the clock inside tick through 47 seconds. She counted, and then she heard boot heels on a wood floor. Uneven. One heel heavier than the other. Getting closer. The door opened. She had steeled herself for contempt. For the specific bored variety of dismissal that men of his position practiced on women they had already decided weren't worth their attention. She had rehearsed during the 14-mile ride exactly how she would hold her face when he told her to get back in the carriage that was no longer there. Nathaniel Caldwell opened the door and stepped back. "Come in," he said, "before you lose what's left of the morning." I was taller than she'd pictured, and thinner with dark hair, too long for polite society, and a jaw that looked like it had never once found a reason to soften. His coat was plain and chosen for use rather than appearance. He held the sealed letter, still sealed in his left hand, and he looked at her the way a man looks at an equation he hasn't solved yet but intends to. He turned and walked back down the hallway. She followed. The study he led her into had no pretension in it anywhere. Books with broken spines, maps covered in handwritten annotations, a desk buried under account ledgers. He went to the desk, broke the seal on the letter, and read it standing up. Eleanor watched his face. She watched it go through something, not anger, not amusement, something flatter than either. The expression of a man who has encountered a variety of human behavior that he finds simultaneously predictable and tiresome. He set the letter on the desk. He looked at her. "Your stepmother," he said, "writes that you have developed what she calls an unbecoming attachment to my person. She is sending you here so that I can discourage your behavior directly." He paused. "There is a postscript. She regrets the inconvenience and hopes I won't be too hard on you." The room was very quiet. "She wrote that," Eleanor said. "Not a question." Word for word. Eleanor looked at the letter on the desk. At the red wax seal broken, now curled at the edge. Margaret's family crest facing the ceiling. "Before I left Richmond this morning," Eleanor said carefully, "how many people do you imagine she had already told?" Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. "All of them," he said. "Yes," Eleanor said. That would be her method. The full shape of it landed then. Not as a surprise, she had known something like this was coming, had felt it assembling itself over months in the quiet, careful way Margaret assembled things, but as the specific final weight of a thing that has moved from probable to certain. She was standing in a stranger's house inside a story that had been written about her before she arrived, and every version of that story that Margaret had circulated through Richmond's parlors ended the same way. Eleanor Whitmore disgraced. Eleanor Whitmore humiliated. Eleanor Whitmore with nowhere left to go. She looked at the chair nearest the window. "May I sit down?" she said. Caldwell crossed the chair and moved it toward her, a deliberate gesture, unhurried, and said, "You may." She sat. He remained standing. He went to the window and was quiet for a moment, looking out at the east field. Then he said without turning around, "What is it you actually want, Miss Whitmore? Not what she wants. Not what you came here to say because you thought you had to say it. What do you want?" The directness of it almost caught her off guard. Almost. "Not marriage," she said. "Not charity. Not to be sent back." "Then what?" She looked at the ledgers on his desk. "Work," she said. "Real work. I managed my father's accounts for 4 years before he died. I know what a balance sheet looks like, and I know what fraud looks like inside one." She paused. "If your finances are in order, I'll find something else. But I won't go back to that house. And I won't be a burden. And I would rather earn my place than be handed one." The silence stretched. Outside, a horse moved somewhere behind the barn. A man laughed at something, the sound carrying clean across the summer morning. Caldwell turned from the window. "My account manager retired in March," he said. "His replacement lasted 6 weeks." He moved back toward the desk. "I have 300 acres of active land, 2 tenant agreements currently in dispute, and a shipping interest in Alexandria that has been losing money for 2 years in ways that nobody has explained to my satisfaction." He stopped. "My housekeeper is Mrs. Granger. She'll find you a room. House rules are 3. Don't lie to me. Don't pretend to know things you don't know, and don't vanish when the numbers get difficult." "I don't vanish," Eleanor said. "No," he said. "You came 14 miles in July heat with 1 trunk and a letter designed to end you. People who vanish don't do that." He sat down at the desk carefully, the way men with old injuries lower themselves into chairs, and opened the top ledger without looking at her again. "The last 3 years of account books are in the cabinet behind you. Take today. Tell me tomorrow morning what you see." Eleanor stood. She crossed to the cabinet. Behind her, Caldwell said, "She thought she was sending you somewhere that would break you." Eleanor's hand was on the cabinet door. "She's been trying to break me for 4 years," she said. "She hasn't found the right instrument yet." A pause. "No," Caldwell said quietly. "I can see that." She opened the cabinet. She got to work. The ledgers were worse than she'd anticipated, and she had anticipated bad. She pulled the account books for all 3 years, spread them across the desk in order, and started at the beginning, the way her father had taught her, not looking for what was wrong, but building a picture of what should be right, so that the wrongness would announce itself by contrast. The first year was almost too clean. Precise entries. Every column balanced to the penny. The handwriting of a man trying to prove something. The second year was where it started. Small at first figures moved between categories in ways that balanced individually, but created a pattern when you stepped back and looked at all 3 years together. Eleanor took out the folded piece of paper she kept in her father's journal for exactly this kind of work and began drawing the pattern out. Not in numbers, in lines and arrows. A map of where the money went when it was supposed to be going somewhere else. She was 40 minutes into the third year when the door opened. She did not look up. "Miss Whitmore." It was Mrs. Granger carrying a tray. "You've not eaten since—" "I ate this morning," Eleanor said. "Set it there, please. I'll get to it." A pause. "The morning was 6 hours ago." Eleanor looked up. Mrs. Granger was a small, broad woman with capable hands and the face of someone who had watched a great many people make a great many decisions and had learned to distinguish the ones worth interfering with. She was looking at this paper on the desk, the map of arrows, with an expression Eleanor could not read. "You found something," Mrs. Granger said. It was not a question. "I found the beginning of something," Eleanor said. "I'll know more by this evening." Mrs. Granger set the tray down. She looked at the ledgers. She looked at Eleanor. "The last man who sat at that desk," she said slowly, "looked at those same books for 3 weeks and told Mr. Caldwell everything was fine." "Then he wasn't looking at the right things," Eleanor said. Mrs. Granger nodded once. A small final nod, the kind that meant a judgment had been made and would not be revisited. "I'll bring supper at 7, she said, "whether you've eaten the noon meal or not." She left. Eleanor looked back at the ledgers. The third year was a different handwriting. She picked up her pencil and kept going. By the time the summer light shifted out of the west-facing window and the room went amber and then gray. And gray, Eleanor had 3 pages of notes and a map that told a story she recognized. Not because she was a genius, because she had seen it before, in her father's accounts. 18 months before he died. A slow leak disguised as accounting variance. Small amounts, moved in patterns that looked like normal fluctuation until you placed all 3 years against each other and traced the single thread that ran through all of them. She had caught it then. Too late to recover everything, but early enough to stop the bleeding. She had not been able to tell her father who was responsible. He had believed her about the numbers. He had not believed her about the man she suspected. 3 months later, that man was still working for the family. 6 months after that, her father was dead, and the man was gone, and Margaret was in charge of everything. Eleanor set down her pencil. She looked at the map she had drawn. Then she picked up the ledger and the map, and walked down the hall and knocked on Caldwell's study door. "Come in." She opened it. He was at his desk writing. He looked up. She crossed the room without being invited and set the ledger and the map on the desk in front of him. "Your shipping interest in Alexandria isn't losing money by accident," she said. He put his pen down. "Tell me." She talked for 20 minutes. She walked him through the map, where the money entered, where it moved, where it arrived, dressed as something slightly different from what it had been when it started. She pointed at specific ledger entries. She showed him the pattern in year 2. She showed him how year 3 accelerated it. He asked questions, sharp ones, the kind that told her he was following the logic, not just the words. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment. "Pearson," he said. "Who is Pearson?" "My shipping manager in Alexandria. 4 years." He said it the way people said things they were recalibrating. 4 years and not once. "He's been moving $12 at a time," Eleanor said. "Never more. 7 entries per quarter. It looks like variance. It only looks like theft when you lay all 3 years flat and draw the line." She paused. Whoever taught him to do it this way knew exactly how account reviews work. They knew the number below which an auditor stops looking closely. Caldwell looked at the map. "How much total?" he said. "Approximately $3,000 over 18 months, possibly more if the pattern started before the third ledger." The room was very still. "3,000, he said. "At minimum." He stood up from his desk slowly, that careful movement of a man who had learned to manage his body around a permanent injury, and walked to the window. He stood there with his back to her and said nothing for a long moment. Then, "You found this in 1 day." "I knew what to look for," Eleanor said. 3 men looked at those books this year. None of them. "They were looking for errors," she said. "Honest men look for honest mistakes. You don't find intentional fraud by looking for errors. You find it by looking for patterns that are too consistent to be accidental." He turned from the window. "Where did you learn that?" "My father." She looked at the map on his desk. "He used to say a liar's mistake is never in what they changed. It's in what they forgot to change." Something moved in Caldwell's expression. Not sentiment. Something more solid than that. The specific look of a man who has just recalibrated his understanding of who is in the room with him. "The physical records in Alexandria," he said. "If Pearson is running a secondary ledger." "Hi is," Eleanor said. "Men who steal this methodically always keep a record. It makes them feel less like thieves. Don't write to him directly. Don't write to anyone connected to the shipping office. If he hears you're looking, the secondary records disappear and you lose the evidence." "I know a federal judge," Caldwell said slowly. "Harding. Served with him in the war. He could pull the physical records under an independent commercial pretext. Pearson would have no warning." "That would work," Eleanor said. "Write tonight. Don't mention me. Don't mention fraud, yet just request a routine review. If the secondary ledger exists, Judge Harding will find it." Caldwell looked at her. "You," he said, "are not what I expected." "I'm not what anyone expects," Eleanor said. "That's been the problem my entire life." A beat. Then something crossed his face that she had not seen there before. Something dry and unexpected. That he said has been everyone else's loss. He picked up his pen. He began writing to Judge Harding. Eleanor gathered the ledgers from his desk and went back to the cabinet to file them. At the door, she paused. "Mr. Caldwell." He looked up. "The letter Margaret sent, whatever copies she's already distributed through Richmond, they'll be expecting a specific outcome. Me disgraced, sent away. The story she told already has an ending." "Yes," he said. "I want you to know," Eleanor said, "that I have no intention of giving her that ending." He held her gaze. "Neither," he said, "do I." That night, Eleanor sat on the edge of the bed in the small blue room and opened her father's journal. Not the account journal. The other one. The one where he had written things down, not for the business, but for her, though she had only understood that after he was gone. She turned to the page she had read more times than she could count. Look at everything directly, Eleanor. Especially the things that are uncomfortable to see. The truth doesn't reward people who look away from it. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about the map she had drawn today, and the $3,000, and the way Caldwell had said Pearson in that recalibrating voice. She thought about Margaret at the top of the staircase this morning, with her hands folded and her chin lifted. And then she thought about something she had not let herself think about yet. Margaret had not simply sent her here to be humiliated. Margaret was not careless. She did not operate carelessly. Every move she made served 2 purposes, minimum. Purpose 1, destroy Eleanor's reputation by associating her name with a scandal in Caldwell's house. Purpose 2. Eleanor sat up. She reached for the account journal, the one she had been carrying since her father died, and she opened it to the last page she had written in. Before she left Richmond. The notes she had made over the past 2 years, quietly, carefully in the margins of her father's old estate records. The numbers she had never been able to prove, because she had never had access to the right ledgers. She looked at the numbers. She looked at the window. She thought about what Margaret stood to gain from Eleanor being gone. Not just disgraced, not just sent away, but permanently removed from any position from which she could examine the Whitmore estate accounts. Her father's estate accounts. The ones she had not seen since the morning after the funeral, when Margaret had handed them to a new solicitor in Richmond, and Eleanor had not had the legal standing to object. Her heart was beating faster. She was not here because Margaret wanted to humiliate her. She was here because Margaret needed her far away from Richmond while something was finalized. Something in those estate accounts. Something Eleanor, if she'd had the right legal ally and the right position from which to examine them, might have been able to stop. She stood up. She went to the window. The Virginia night pressed in from all directions, dense and hot and full of crickets and the sound of the creek moving through the east field. Out there somewhere, a man named Pearson was sleeping soundly in Alexandria, unaware that by morning a letter was already on its way to a federal judge. And in Richmond, Eleanor was equally certain. Margaret Holloway was sitting in a dining room built with another man's money, confident that the last obstacle between her and everything she wanted had finally been removed. Eleanor pressed her hand flat against the window glass. "You sent me here to disappear," she thought. "You needed me gone, not just humiliated. You needed me somewhere I couldn't ask the right questions to the right people." She looked at the dark estate around her. The 300 acres. The barn. The fields. The man in this house who had in one single day looked her in the eye and offered her work instead of charity, a chair instead of contempt, and a legal ally instead of a door. "You made a mistake, Margaret. You sent me somewhere with a lawyer's contact, a federal judge connection, and account books I can actually read. You sent me to the one place in Virginia where someone might actually listen." She turned from the window. She went back to the desk. She opened the estate journal to a clean page, and she began for the first time to write down everything she knew. She wrote until the candle burned down to nothing. By the time the first gray light came through the east window, Eleanor had filled 11 pages. Not speculation, not grievance. Dates, figures, names, patterns. The same kind of map she had drawn for Caldwell's shipping ledgers, but this one had been assembling itself in the back of her mind for 2 years. Built from fragments she had gathered the only way available to her, quietly, without appearing to look in the margins of conversations she wasn't supposed to be having and documents she wasn't supposed to have seen. Her father's estate had been worth $60,000 at the time of his death. That was not a guess. She had seen the appraisal herself 2 days before he died, when he had called her into the study and shown her the documents, with the particular careful attention of a man who understood that he was running out of time to say what needed to be said. "This is yours," he had told her. "Not Margaret's, not the girl's. Yours. I've written it clearly. Any competent solicitor will confirm it." He had died 4 days later. The solicitor Margaret hired was named Aldridge. Eleanor had never met him. She had been told gently but firmly by Margaret herself that her presence at the legal proceedings was unnecessary and would in fact complicate matters. She had been 19 years old and had no legal standing to compel anything different. She had never seen her father's will. She had never seen the estate appraisal again. She had been told by Margaret 6 months after the funeral that the estate had been found to carry significant debts, that the appraisal had been revised, and that Eleanor's inheritance after those debts were satisfied amounted to $400 and the contents of her bedroom. Eleanor had taken the $400. She had taken the contents of her bedroom. She had been 20 years old with no legal standing and no allies, and she had understood that fighting Margaret directly was a battle she could not yet win. She had decided to wait. She had decided to learn. She had decided that eventually, if she was patient and careful, and kept her eyes open, she would find the lever. She looked at the 11 pages spread across the small desk in the blue room. She thought about Nathaniel Caldwell writing a letter to a federal judge at 11 o'clock the previous night. She thought perhaps the lever just found me. She came down at dawn. Caldwell was already in the study, which did not surprise her. He had the look of a man who had never required much sleep and had long since stopped pretending otherwise. He was at his desk with a cup of coffee and the Alexandria ledger open in front of him, and he looked up when she appeared in the doorway. She was carrying the 11 pages. He looked at them, then at her face. "Sit down," he said. "I need to ask you something first," she said. "And I need you to answer me honestly, because what I tell you next depends on whether I can trust what you say." A pause. "Ask," he said. "When you look at me," Eleanor said, "do you see a woman who came here in a damaged situation and needs to be managed carefully so she doesn't cause further trouble? Or do you see someone who found $3,000 in stolen funds in a single afternoon and might have something else worth hearing?" Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. "I sent the letter to Harding at midnight," he said. "I was still awake at midnight because I was reading those account books again, checking your figures. They held." He paused. "I see someone worth hearing. Sit down." She sat. She put the 11 pages on the desk between them. "This is about my father's estate," she said, "and I think it's why Margaret sent me here." She talked for 30 minutes. Not the way she had talked about Pearson methodically building a case with numbers. This was harder. This required her to speak about things she had been carrying alone for 2 years, without letting her voice do anything that would make him see her as a grieving daughter, rather than a woman with information worth taking seriously. She told him about the estate appraisal, about the solicitor named Aldridge, about the $400 and the bedroom contents, about the 2 years of quiet observation, about the specific figures that had never added up in the version of the story Margaret told. He did not interrupt. He looked at the pages she had brought. He asked when she finished 3 questions: the name of the solicitor, the county in which the estate was probated, and the name of the bank where her father had maintained his primary accounts. She answered all 3. He wrote them down. Then he leaned back in his chair and looked at her with an expression she was beginning to recognize, the one that meant he was calculating something. "If what you're describing is accurate," he said slowly, "the estate was fraudulently probated. That is a federal matter, not just a civil one, particularly if Aldridge filed false documents with the county court." "Yes," Eleanor said. "I know. Do you have any documentation? Anything with your name on it from before your father's death that establishes what he told you about the inheritance?" "I have his journal," she said. "The one he kept for himself. He wrote about the estate, about his intentions. It isn't a legal document, but it establishes prior knowledge of his wishes," Caldwell said. He was nodding slowly. "Which matters if the will that was filed is not the will he actually wrote." Eleanor stared at him. She had suspected this for 2 years. Hearing someone else say it plainly, not the possibility, but the mechanics of it calmly and specifically, was something she had not been prepared for. "You think the will was forged," she said. "I think," Caldwell said carefully, "that a woman who orchestrated what she did this week, distributing a letter designed to destroy your reputation, timing your removal from Richmond to coincide with something she needed finalized, is not operating casually. That kind of precision requires planning. And the most important thing to finalize if you have fraudulently probated an estate is making absolutely certain that the one person who can identify the fraud is somewhere she cannot make trouble." The room was very quiet. Eleanor said, "She sent me here because I was getting close." Or, Caldwell said, "because she needed you gone before a specific legal deadline. Probate records can be contested within a certain window. After that window closes, a filed document, even a fraudulent one, becomes considerably harder to overturn." "How long is the window?" He looked at her. "In Virginia," he said, 5 years from the date of filing." Eleanor did exactly the arithmetic she did not want to do. Her father had died in March of 1815. It was now July of 1820. 4 months, she said. Her voice was completely level. She was proud of that. "I have 4 months." "Yes," Caldwell said. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Eleanor picked up her pencil, pulled a clean sheet of paper toward her and said, "Then we had better move quickly." Caldwell looked at her. Something passed over his face. Not quite admiration, not yet, but something adjacent to it. The specific expression of a man who has spent 6 years keeping his own counsel and is unexpectedly finding that another person's counsel is worth keeping alongside his. "Write down Aldridge's full name," he said, "and the county seat where the probate was filed." She wrote it. He picked up his pen. He started a second letter. Mrs. Granger appeared at the study door at 7:30 with a tray that she set on the corner of the desk without comment, and then stood looking at the two of them. Eleanor with her pages. Caldwell writing with an expression that was not quite approval, but was moving in that direction. "Breakfast," she said. "Thank you, Mrs. Granger," Eleanor said. "The boy from the stable yard came up this morning," Mrs. Granger said, addressing Caldwell. "Amos Fletcher was at the south fence line before sunup. Wanted to talk to you about the east field boundary again." Caldwell did not look up from his writing. "Tell Fletcher I'll be out before noon." He also mentioned, Mrs. Granger said, with a precision that suggested this was the part she had been building toward, that he'd heard something in town yesterday. About a letter. He didn't say from whom. The room went still. Caldwell put his pen down. Eleanor set her pencil down. "What letter?" Caldwell said. Mrs. Granger looked at Eleanor. Not unkindly, but directly. "Apparently, there's a story going around Richmond that a young woman arrived at this house yesterday under circumstances that," she paused, choosing, "that certain people have found interesting." "Interesting," Eleanor said. "The word they're using from what Amos heard at the post office is scandalous." The word landed in the room like a stone into still water. Eleanor thought she didn't wait even one day. Of course she hadn't. Margaret never waited. Waiting was for people who weren't certain of their material. "Who is circulating it?" Caldwell said. His voice had gone to something flat and specific. "No one is saying," Mrs. Granger said. "No one ever says. But the shape of the story matches a letter that apparently several people in Richmond received yesterday morning, before Miss Whitmore had even arrived here. Before Eleanor had arrived. Margaret had written the letters before Eleanor left. She had distributed them before the carriage had traveled the first mile. She had been so certain of the outcome that she had pre-written the ending. Eleanor looked at her hands on the desk. They were steady. She noticed that and filed it away. Her hands were steady, which meant the part of her that needed to function was still functioning, and everything else could wait. "Mrs. Granger," she said, "what exactly is the story they're telling?" Mrs. Granger looked at Caldwell. He gave her a small nod. "That you pursued Mr. Caldwell without invitation," she said. "That your stepmother, in an act of considerable generosity, attempted to intervene for your sake. That you were removed from the Holloway household and delivered here because your behavior had become—" Another pause. "Ungovernable. Ungovernable." Eleanor almost laughed. Not because it was funny, because it was so precisely chosen. Not immoral, not scandalous in the obvious direction, just ungovernable. A woman who could not be managed. A woman who had stepped outside the boundaries of what women were permitted to want. In 1820, Virginia ungovernable was almost worse than the other thing. "Mr. Caldwell," Eleanor said without looking up from her hands. "Miss Whitmore, I want to be very clear about something." She looked up. "If you need me to leave in order to protect your own reputation from this story, I will leave. I will not argue with that decision. I'll find another arrangement." Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "Mrs. Granger, is the blue room comfortable?" Mrs. Granger blinked. "It's clean and it's quiet and the mattress is newer than the others." "Good," Caldwell said. He picked up his pen. "Because Miss Whitmore will be occupying it for the foreseeable future in her capacity as my account manager. And if Amos Fletcher or anyone else in this county has a question about that arrangement, they're welcome to come ask me directly." He looked back down at his paper. "Tell Fletcher I'll be at the south fence at 10. Mrs. Granger looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Granger. Something passed between them. Not words, but the particular understanding that moves between women who have, each in their own time, been in a room where a man said something that mattered. 10 o'clock, Mrs. Granger said, and left. The letter to Judge Harding went out that morning with the first post. The letter to a man named Calloway, a Richmond attorney, who Caldwell explained without elaborating, owed him a professional debt of long standing, went out by private courier 2 hours later. Eleanor spent the morning in the study, pulling apart the second-year ledgers with the same careful attention she had given the first and third building. The complete picture of the fraud in Caldwell's shipping accounts, while Caldwell rode out to meet Amos Fletcher at the south fence. She worked in the quiet way she always worked, which was with her whole attention, and without needing anyone to confirm she was doing it correctly. She was halfway through the morning's work when she heard the carriage. Not Caldwell returning, he was on horseback. She had heard him leave, and a horse's return sounded different from wheels on the unpaved approach road. She heard the wheels. She heard Mrs. Granger's voice in the front hall, sharp and unwelcoming. She heard a voice she knew. Eleanor set her pencil down. She stood up slowly. She walked to the study door and opened it. At the end of the front hall, with her traveling coat still on, and her chin at its familiar lifted angle, stood Margaret Holloway. She had not wasted a single day. Margaret looked at Eleanor, the way she always looked at Eleanor, with the specific patient expression of a woman who has already counted all the cards and knows she holds the better hand. She had brought no companion, no husband, no ally from Richmond society. She had come alone, which told Eleanor something important. Margaret was not here to perform for an audience. She was here to conduct business. "Eleanor," she said, pleasantly. "You look well." "Mrs. Holloway," Eleanor said. She did not move from the doorway. She did not invite her in. Mrs. Granger stood 2 feet behind Margaret with her arms folded and the expression of a woman who would require specific instruction before she allowed this visitor any further into the house. "I came," Margaret said, still pleasantly, "because I was concerned. The journey here is long for a young woman alone, and I wanted to assure myself that you arrived safely, and that—" she glanced at the study behind Eleanor at the ledgers visible on the desk, "that the situation has been appropriately resolved." "Which situation?" Eleanor said. A small pause. "Your situation, dear." "I have a position here," Eleanor said. "Account manager. I started yesterday. I've already identified a significant discrepancy in the Alexandria shipping accounts that Mr. Caldwell's previous managers missed. The situation is quite well resolved, thank you." Margaret's expression did not change. It never changed when she was recalculating. "I'm relieved to hear you're comfortable," she said. "Though, of course, given the nature of the circumstances under which you arrived, the letter I wrote was intended to be private." "Eleanor, I'm sorry if—" "The letter you wrote," Eleanor said, "was delivered to Richmond's post office before my carriage had passed the first-mile marker. It wasn't private. It was designed." Silence. Margaret looked at her. Eleanor looked back. "I would like to speak to Mr. Caldwell," Margaret said. The pleasantness was still there, but it had thinned slightly. The way ice thins in late February, still present, still presenting itself as solid, but the structure changed underneath. "He's on the south field," Eleanor said. "Mrs. Granger can send someone to fetch him if you'd like to wait, in the front parlor." She said it with the precise courtesy of a woman who has spent 4 years learning exactly how courtesy can be used as a boundary. Margaret understood it immediately. Eleanor could see that she did, and the understanding moved across her face in a single brief adjustment before the pleasantness reasserted itself. "I'll wait," Margaret said. Caldwell came in from the south field 20 minutes later. Eleanor had returned to the study and closed the door. Not all the way. She left it 3 inches open, which was not eavesdropping. It was information gathering, and she had stopped feeling guilty about those distinctions a long time ago. She heard Margaret's voice from the parlor, warm and concerned, explaining to Nathaniel Caldwell what an unfortunate misunderstanding this entire situation had been, how Eleanor had always been a difficult girl, despite Margaret's best efforts, how she was certain Mr. Caldwell was a man of the world, and understood that young women in unstable circumstances sometimes behaved in ways that reflected their instability rather than any fault in the people trying to help them. She heard Caldwell say nothing for a long time. When he spoke, his voice was so quiet, she had to move closer to the door to hear it. "Mrs. Holloway," he said, How many copies of that letter did you send before Miss Whitmore left your house? A pause. I beg your pardon. The letter. The one you wrote characterizing Miss Whitmore's behavior. You sent it to me. How many other copies went out the same morning? Another pause. Longer. I wrote privately. You wrote to the Richmond postmaster, Caldwell said. That is a matter of record. I'm asking how many recipients. Margaret's voice when it came had changed. Not much. A degree. The specific shift of a woman who has encountered a variable she did not account for. I wrote to a few close friends, she said, in concern. How many? I don't see why that, Mrs. Holloway. His voice had not risen. It had dropped. I have been a patient man in this conversation because you are a woman who traveled some distance this morning, and I was raised to extend basic courtesy. But I want to be clear with you about what I have understood in the past 24 hours about the situation you created. A pause. You sent Miss Whitmore here carrying a letter you had pre-distributed to Richmond society, timed to arrive in other hands before she arrived in my house. You characterized her behavior in terms designed to make her return to Richmond impossible. You came here today one day later, which tells me whatever you came to accomplish has a timeline. Another pause. What is it you need finished before she can come home? Mrs. Holloway. What specifically requires her absence? The parlor went completely silent. Eleanor pressed her back against the wall beside the study door and breathed. She had not expected him to ask that question. She had not expected anyone to ask that question. She had spent 2 years alone with that question. Margaret's voice, when it returned, was very controlled. I don't know what she's told you, she said. But Eleanor has always had a talent for making herself the injured party in situations of her own making. She hasn't told me anything you'd find interesting, Caldwell said. She's been reviewing my account books. She's quite good at it. A beat. Better than the 3 men I hired before her. She is not, Margaret said with sudden sharpness that cracked through the control, a professional anything. She is a young woman with no legal standing, no income of her own, and a tendency to develop ideas about things that are not her concern. Her father's estate, Caldwell said quietly, is not her concern. The silence that followed was different from the ones before it. Eleanor felt it from the other side of the wall, the quality of it, the weight, the specific species of quiet that arrives when something has been said that cannot be unsaid. She has been talking to you, Margaret said, very low. Miss Whitmore is my account manager, Caldwell said. She talks to me about accounts. Whatever conclusions I have drawn from the documents currently sitting on my desk. He paused. You should know that I have been in contact with Judge Harding in Alexandria, and with Attorney Calloway in Richmond. A chair moved in the parlor. Eleanor heard it, the specific sound of a woman standing up abruptly. This conversation, Margaret said, is over. The one between you and me, yes, Caldwell said. The other conversations are still beginning. Eleanor heard footsteps. She moved back from the door, crossed the study, and sat down at the desk with the ledger open in front of her. By the time the parlor door opened, she picked up her pencil. She looked at the numbers on the page. She heard Margaret's heels on the hallway floor. They slowed outside the study door. Eleanor did not look up. Eleanor, Margaret said. Eleanor finished writing the figure she was working on. Then she looked up. Margaret stood in the doorway. Her composure was entirely reassembled, every line of her face precise, and settled, the traveling coat brushed smooth the chin at its usual angle. But something behind her eyes had shifted, and Eleanor, who had been studying Margaret's eyes for 4 years, saw it clearly. Margaret was not afraid, but she was no longer certain. Those were different things. But for Eleanor in this moment, one was enough. Margaret, she said. Whatever you think you found, Margaret said quietly, you should be very careful about what you do with it. You have no legal standing. You have no documentation. You have no allies who matter. I have 4 months, Eleanor said. Margaret looked at her. And I'm not in Richmond anymore, Eleanor continued. I'm not in your house subject to your schedule dependent on your goodwill for my meals and my movements. I'm in a house with a working attorney, contact a federal judge connection, and 3 years of account books that I have now read more carefully than anyone has ever read them. She set her pencil down. You sent me here to disappear. You should have been more careful about where you chose to send me. Margaret said nothing. She looked at Eleanor the way she had looked at her across that dining room table 100 times with the patience of a woman who believed she held more cards. But Eleanor was beginning to understand something about card games that she hadn't fully grasped before. You only needed one card if it was the right one. Safe travels back to Richmond, Eleanor said, and looked back at her ledger. She heard Margaret's footsteps resume. She heard the front door. She heard the carriage wheels on the approach road moving away. She sat very still for a moment. Then Caldwell appeared in the study doorway. He looked at her. She looked at him. She'll move faster now, Eleanor said. Yes, he said. She will. Whatever she needs to finalize before I can contest the probate, she'll try to complete it in the next few weeks. Not 4 months. Weeks. I know. He came into the room and stood at the window. Calloway will move on my instruction. Harding's office will respond within 10 days. If Aldridge filed false documents, there will be a record. If the will was forged, Eleanor said, there will be a record of the original. My father was meticulous. He used the same solicitor for 20 years before he died. A man named Prescott in Fredericksburg. I don't know if Prescott is still practicing, but if he is, then he has the original will, Caldwell said. He turned from the window. Or a copy. Yes. He looked at her steadily. This is going to get complicated, Miss Whitmore. Before it resolves, it is going to get substantially worse. Margaret Holloway is not going to absorb this morning without a response, and her response is unlikely to be quiet. I know, Eleanor said. You understand that staying here continuing in this capacity will attach my name to this matter. People will draw conclusions about my motivations. She looked at him directly. Do you want me to leave? He held her gaze. No, he said. I want you to find Prescott. Eleanor reached for a clean sheet of paper. She began to write. Outside, the Virginia summer was at full blaze, fields and heat, and the sound of working men and ordinary days. And Eleanor Whitmore was drafting a letter to a solicitor in Fredericksburg who might be holding the document that changed everything. Thinking with the quiet and practical certainty that had kept her alive and moving for 4 long years, that Margaret Holloway had made one mistake in an otherwise very careful plan. She had underestimated how much ground could be covered in a single day when a person finally had somewhere to stand. The letter from Fredericksburg arrived on a Thursday. Eleanor knew it was important before she opened it, the way you know certain things, not from logic, but from the particular quality of stillness that settles over a moment just before it changes everything. She had been at the study desk for 6 days straight, working through Caldwell's tenant dispute documents in the mornings and her own father's estate. Reconstruction in the afternoons, building the case, the way her father had taught her to build anything worth building from the foundation up, not from the conclusion backward. She had written to Prescott, her father's original solicitor in Fredericksburg, 8 days ago. She had not told him everything. She had told him enough. That she was Thomas Whitmore's daughter. That she had questions about her father's estate documents. That she understood he might not be at liberty to share certain things, but that if he still held any records from his work with her father, she would be grateful to know it. She had not expected a response in 8 days. She had not expected a response at all, if she was honest with herself, because the last 2 years had taught her that the people who could help often couldn't, and the people who would help often didn't know enough to matter. She broke the seal. She read the letter standing at the desk, still holding the envelope. Then she sat down. Then she read it again. Prescott was 81 years old and had retired from active practice 3 years ago, but he had not, as it turned out, destroyed his files. He had a clerk. The clerk had located the relevant documents within a day of receiving Eleanor's inquiry. Prescott himself had written the response in a handwriting that was shaky but precise, and what he wrote was this. He had prepared Thomas Whitmore's will in February of 1815, 6 weeks before Thomas died. He had a signed copy. He had a witnessed copy. The primary beneficiary of the Whitmore estate in the will he had prepared and filed with Thomas Whitmore's direct authorization was Eleanor Catherine. Whitmore's sole daughter to receive the estate in full upon reaching the age of 21 or upon her father's death, whichever came later. There was a second paragraph. Prescott wrote that he had been contacted in June of 1815, 3 months after Thomas Whitmore's death, by a solicitor named Aldridge, who had informed him that a later will had superseded his document and that his copy was therefore moot. Prescott had found this irregular. He had written to the county court to inquire. He had been told by a clerk he did not know personally that the matter was settled and his inquiry was unnecessary. He had retained his copy regardless. He had retained it for 5 years against the possibility that someone would one day ask. Eleanor set the letter down on the desk. She pressed both hands flat on the surface, one on either side of the paper, and breathed. 5 years. He had held it for 5 years. She heard Caldwell's step in the hallway. She had learned the exact sound of it, one heel heavier than the other, a rhythm as recognizable to her now as her own heartbeat, and she looked up when he appeared in the doorway. He read her face. He came into the room. She handed him the letter without speaking. He read it. He read it again. He set it down on the desk and looked at her. "Prescott still has the original will," he said. "Yes." "Witnessed and signed. 6 weeks before my father died," she said. "Not 4 years before, not 10 years before. 6 weeks. He knew he was sick. He made certain it was done correctly." She paused. "The will Margaret filed through Aldridge superseded a document that my father signed when he was 22 years old and had just married her. Before I was born. Before he had any estate worth speaking of. Before he had any idea who she was." Caldwell was very still. "She found an old document," he said slowly. "Or she had one made," Eleanor said. "Either way, she filed it as the most recent expression of his wishes and suppressed the one he actually wrote 6 weeks before he died." She looked at the letter. Prescott flagged the irregularity at the time. He was told to drop it. Who told him? A county court clerk he didn't know. Caldwell picked up the letter again and read the second paragraph a second time. When he set it down, his jaw had a set to it that Eleanor had not seen before. "I need to make a trip," he said. "To Fredericksburg. To Fredericksburg first, then to Richmond." He looked at her. "Calloway has been digging into Aldridge's filing record. He sent a note yesterday I didn't want to tell you until I had something more complete. But given this..." He crossed to his desk and opened the top drawer and took out a folded note she hadn't seen before. He handed it to her. She read it. Calloway had found in the county court records in Richmond that the will filed by Aldridge had been witnessed by 2 men. One of them was a business associate of Margaret's current attorney. The other had died in 1817, 2 years after the filing. Dead witnesses could not recant. But there was a third name on the document. A notary. A man named William Calder of Richmond, who was, as of Calloway's inquiry, still very much alive. "He notarized a fraudulent document," Eleanor said. "Either knowingly or unknowingly," Caldwell said. "If unknowingly, he's a witness. If knowingly, he's a liability that Aldridge and Margaret will want managed before this goes any further." Eleanor looked up. "If they know we've found Calder..." "They may try to reach him first," Caldwell said. "Yes." She was already on her feet. "Then we need to reach him before they do," she said. Caldwell rode to Richmond the next morning before dawn. He did not take Eleanor. They had discussed it the night before practically, and without sentiment, her presence in Richmond right now would alert Margaret's network immediately, and every hour of lead time mattered. He would go alone, meet with Calloway, find Calder, and return within 2 days. Eleanor would stay, continue working on the account ledgers, and wait. She did not like waiting. She had never liked waiting. But she understood the logic, and she had stopped letting what she liked override what made sense somewhere around her 20th birthday. She worked. The first day was quiet. Mrs. Granger brought meals without being asked and made no particular comment about the fact that Eleanor ate them at the desk without pausing. The tenant dispute documents were complex and required careful reading. Reading 2 families, 2 conflicting claims about a fence line and the field rights on the adjacent land. and Eleanor built the timeline from the original lease agreements. Outward the way she always built things, foundation first. By afternoon she had identified the problem. The lease agreement for the Henley family had been renewed in 1818, using a template that contained a standard clause about boundary measurement that contradicted the specific boundary described in the original 1809 document. The contradiction was not accidental. The 1818 template had been used for 3 other renewals that year, all of which contained the same clause, which meant whoever had drafted the renewal template had either made a consistent error or had deliberately drafted language that left boundary definitionally with the specific document references and the clause numbers, the way she would have written it for her father. She set it on Caldwell's desk and went back to her own work. She was deep in the estate reconstruction when Mrs. Granger appeared in the doorway at 4:30, with a look on her face that Eleanor recognized the look of a woman delivering news she had sorted through first and decided to release carefully. "There's a gentleman at the door," Mrs. Granger said. "He says he's from Richmond. He didn't give his name to me. He asked specifically for you." Eleanor set her pencil down. "Did he give a card?" "He did not." "What does he look like?" "Young, well-dressed, nervous." Mrs. Granger paused. "He's been standing on the step for 3 minutes without asking to come in, which tells me he's either polite or uncertain about his welcome." Eleanor stood up. She thought about Caldwell's empty chair. She thought about Margaret moving faster. "Show him into the front parlor," she said. "I'll be there in a moment." The young man's name was Thomas Calder. "How was," he explained, sitting on the edge of the parlor chair with his hat in both hands. "The son of William Calder, the notary. His father had sent him." His father, he said, had been contacted 2 days ago, the day after Calloway's inquiry, by a man who worked for Aldridge's firm, who had come to his father's office with a document for his father to sign. A statement attesting that the notarization of the Whitmore will had been performed correctly and in good faith, and that William Calder had no concerns about the filing. "Did he sign it?" Eleanor said. Thomas Calder looked at his hat. "No, ma'am, he didn't." "Why not?" "Because the man who brought it—" He stopped, started again. "My father has been a notary for 30 years, miss. He knows what a correctly performed notarization looks like. He knows what it feels like when someone comes to him wanting him to say a thing is correct that he knows is not entirely correct." He looked up at her. He told the man he needed time to consider it. The man told him he had 24 hours. Eleanor was very still. "So your father sent you here," she said. "He didn't know who else to contact. He knew someone had inquired about the filing through the county court. He didn't know your name, but he knew the name of the estate." Thomas Calder reached into his coat pocket and produced a small folded paper. "He sent this." She took it. It was a note in an older man's handwriting. Short. 4 lines. "The document I notarized in June of 1815 was presented to me as a standard probate filing. I was told the testator's signature had already been verified by 2 witnesses. I did not independently verify. I have had cause since to question whether I should have. I am prepared to say so formally, if given appropriate protection to do so." Eleanor read it twice. Then she folded it and held it in her hands. "Your father," she said carefully, "understands what formal testimony in a legal contest involves. He understands that it might cost him his notary commission," Thomas Calder said. "He understands it might cost him more than that if the people on the other side of this are the people he suspects." He looked at her steadily. "He sent me anyway." Something moved in Eleanor's chest. Not quite grief. Something older than grief and steadier the specific emotion of discovering. After a long time, believing you were entirely alone in something that you were not entirely alone. "Tell your father," she said, "that Mr. Caldwell will be in contact with him directly upon returning from Richmond. Tell him—" She paused. She made a decision. "Tell him that Thomas Whitmore was an honest man who kept honest records and made certain his intentions were clear before he died. And that his daughter intends to make certain those intentions are honored. And that anyone who helps her do that will have the full support of Nathaniel Caldwell and his legal connections in whatever follows." Thomas Calder nodded. He stood up. He put his hat on. At the parlor door he stopped. "Miss Whitmore," he said, "my father said to tell you one more thing." She looked at him. He said the man who brought the statement for him to sign, the man from Aldridge's firm, mentioned before he left that the matter would be resolved one way or another within the month, that certain filings were nearly complete. He looked at her. My father said he thought you should know that, because it sounded like a deadline. Eleanor held the note in both hands. Thank you, she said. He left. She stood in the empty parlor and looked at the note for a long moment. Within the month. She had thought she had 4 months. She had weeks, maybe less. She turned and walked back to the study and sat down at the desk and picked up her pencil and got back to work, because there was nothing else to do, and because her father's voice was very clear in her memory, saying, when the ground shifts under you, Eleanor, you plant your feet harder. You don't look down, you look forward. She looked forward. She kept writing. Caldwell came back the second evening later than expected, and Eleanor heard his horse in the yard before she heard the door, and she was already in the hallway when he came in. He looked at her. She looked at him. There was enough in both their faces that they went immediately to the study without either of them saying anything unnecessary. He sat down. She sat across from him. She slid Thomas Calder's note across the desk. He read it. He looked up. Calder's son came here, he said. Yesterday afternoon, Aldridge's man got to the father 2 days after Calloway made the inquiry. They moved fast. She waited. What did you find in Richmond? Caldwell set the note down. He leaned back in his chair with the careful movement she had come to associate not with hesitation, but with the particular kind of deliberate thought that preceded something he knew she needed to hear clearly. Calloway pulled the original filing, he said. The will that Aldridge submitted. He had a legal contact in the county clerk's office pull the physical document, not a copy, the original. He examined it. A pause. The paper is correct for 1815. The ink is correct. The format is correct. Whoever prepared it knew what they were doing. But, Eleanor said, your father's signature, Caldwell said, appears on that document 3 times. His full name, his initial, and a mark at the bottom of the final page. That's standard. The full name and the initial are consistent with samples of your father's handwriting that Calloway obtained from his bank records, Caldwell said. The mark at the bottom of the final page is not. Eleanor stopped breathing for a moment. How different, she said. Different enough that Calloway noticed it without being told to look. He says it's the kind of difference that appears when a person signs their name thousands of times across decades. The full signature becomes automatic, almost unconscious, and tends to stay consistent. But a mark, a single initial, or a brief notation is less practiced, less automatic, and therefore more variable. He looked at her. Your father's mark at the bottom of the final page of that will has a specific characteristic that does not appear in any of the 14 other document samples Calloway reviewed. It was added later, Eleanor said. Not a question. Calloway believes the final page was replaced, Caldwell said. The rest of the document may have been genuine. An old will correctly signed, correctly witnessed with the final page, which contains the distribution of assets substituted. The room was completely quiet. Eleanor thought about her father sitting in his study 6 weeks before he died with Prescott across from him, making certain the words were right. Making certain she was protected. Writing it down with the specific care of a man who knew he was running out of time. She thought about someone taking that document apart and putting it back together with a different ending. She used his old will, Eleanor said. The one from when they first married. She had the final page replaced. That would explain how the witnesses are genuine, Caldwell said. They witnessed a real document, just not the final version of it. Can Calloway prove it? With Prescott's copy and Calder's testimony, yes. Prescott's document is dated 6 weeks before your father's death. If it can be demonstrated that his final wishes clearly superseded any earlier will, and that the document filed by Aldridge contains a replaced page. He stopped. It won't be simple. Aldridge will contest it. Margaret will contest it. They have resources and they have connections in the county court, or they wouldn't have gotten this far. But it's possible, Eleanor said. With a federal judge behind the inquiry, Caldwell said, it's more than possible. A long moment. Eleanor looked at the note from William Calder. She looked at the 11 pages she had written the first night still in her father's estate folder on the corner of the desk. She had spent 2 years believing she was assembling puzzle pieces without knowing if the picture they made would ever be clear enough to show anyone. She had spent 2 years being careful and quiet and patient because those were the only tools she had. She was looking at the picture now. It was ugly and clear and completely legible. "They're trying to finalize something," she said. Within the month, Thomas Calder said the man from Aldridge's firm told his father the matter would be resolved one way or another within the month. She looked at Caldwell. What can they finalize that would close this permanently? He thought about it. "A sale," he said. She stared at him. "If Margaret sells the estate, the physical land, the house, the assets to a third-party buyer before the probate is successfully contested, the legal situation becomes considerably more complicated. You'd be contesting a document that has already been acted upon. The buyer is a separate party with separate protections." He paused. "It doesn't make the fraud impossible to prove, but it makes the remedy significantly harder to obtain." "She's selling my father's house," Eleanor said. The words came out flat. Not because she felt nothing, because she felt everything, and the only way to stay functional was to keep her voice level and her hands steady. "She may be in the process of arranging it," Caldwell said. "We don't know that it's done." "She sent me here," Eleanor said, "so I couldn't stop her." "Yes, and if I hadn't found Prescott's letter, if your account books hadn't been in a state that gave me a reason to be at a desk for 6 days, if Calder's son hadn't come here." She stopped. "But all of those things happened," Caldwell said. "Because you offered me a chair," she said, quietly, almost to herself. "Because instead of throwing me out, you let me sit down. Everything else came from that." He looked at her. She looked back. The distance across the desk was not very large, and something in the room had shifted in a way Eleanor noticed and did not have the space to examine right now, so she set it aside, the same way she set aside other things she couldn't afford to look at directly carefully, and with the intention of coming back to it later. "What do we do now?" she said. "Harding's response to my first letter came this morning," Caldwell said. He reached into his coat and produced a folded page. "He's already moving on Pearson in Alexandria. He'll pull the physical shipping records under a commercial audit pretext within the week." He paused. "I wrote to him again from Richmond last night. I told him about the Whitmore estate matter and asked if his authority extended to a concurrent inquiry into the county court filings. Does it? He wrote back by return courier this morning." Caldwell looked at her steadily. "It does." Eleanor pressed her hands flat on the desk. She breathed. "He'll pull the original will filing," she said. "And compare it to Prescott's copy," Caldwell said. "With Calder's testimony about the notarization and Calloway's analysis of the document itself, Harding has enough to open a formal inquiry." "How long?" 2 weeks, maybe 3. "She has weeks," Eleanor said. "Not months. If she's selling." "Calloway is looking into any pending property transactions filed under the Whitmore estate name," Caldwell said. "If a sale is in process, there will be a record. He'll find it." "And if it's already complete?" Caldwell looked at her without flinching. "Then we fight a different battle," he said. "But it won't be complete. She needs buyers, and buyers need time, and a fraudulent probate creates a title defect that any competent buyer solicitor will want resolved before closing. She needs this to look clean before she can sell it." He paused. "It doesn't look clean anymore. Not since Calloway started pulling records." "She knows someone is looking," Eleanor said. "Yes." "She'll move faster." "Yes." "So will we," Eleanor said. She pulled the estate folder toward her. She opened it. She picked up her pencil. "Tell me what Calloway needs from me specifically," she said. "Documentation, testimony, whatever form he needs it in. I'll work through tonight." Caldwell looked at her for a moment. Then he said very quietly, not the voice he used for business, something different, something that sat just slightly outside the careful professional distance they had maintained for 2 weeks. "When did you last sleep a full night?" She kept her eyes on the paper. "I sleep fine." "That is not what I asked." She paused. She thought about the blue room, about the candle burned to nothing, about the 11 pages written in the dark before the first morning. "I'll sleep when this is done," she said. "Eleanor." He had not called her by her given name before. She noticed that the same way she noticed the shift in the room earlier carefully and with the intention of examining it later. You cannot outwork an opponent who has been sleeping. You have to be sharp when this comes to a confrontation, and it will come to a confrontation. She looked up. Howe was looking at her with the same direct assessing expression he had used on the first day, but there was something else in it now. Something that had accumulated over 2 weeks of sitting in the same room, reading the same documents, building the same case from opposite sides of the same desk. He was not looking at her like a useful employee. She was fairly certain he was looking at her like a person. 2 more hours, she said. Then I'll sleep. Something in his jaw shifted slightly, which she had learned was as close as he came to accepting a compromise without fully endorsing it. 2 hours, he said. Then Mrs. Granger will bring tea, and you will stop. Agreed. He stood. He picked up his coat from the chair back. Calder's son, he said at the door. He came here alone because his father sent him, because his father decided 30 years of honest work meant more than a 24-hour deadline from a man he didn't trust. He paused. Your father built something, Miss Whitmore. Not just an estate. He built a reputation that made men like Prescott hold documents for 5 years on the chance someone would come asking. That made a notary send his son down a 14-mile road on a working day. He looked at her. That doesn't happen by accident. That happens because the man who died was worth honoring. Eleanor looked at the folder. Her hands were steady. Her eyes were not quite, and she was aware of that, and she kept her head down until they were again. Thank you, she said. He left. She picked up her pencil. She worked. And somewhere in Richmond she knew Margaret Holloway was working too faster now with the specific urgency of a woman who had felt the ground move and understood what it meant, and the distance between them was no longer 14 miles of summer road. It was 2 weeks, maybe less, and everything that mattered was going to happen in between. Calloway's letter arrived on a Monday. Eleanor knew before she finished the first paragraph that everything had changed because the handwriting which she had come to recognize over 3 weeks of correspondence as the precise, unhurried script of a man who measured his words was pressed harder than usual into the paper. Not urgency exactly. Something past urgency. The specific quality of a man writing fast because what he has found cannot wait for a more careful hand. She read it standing at the desk. She read it twice. Then she walked to the door of the study and said, Mrs. Granger, where is Mr. Caldwell? South barn. Mrs. Granger called from the kitchen. With the Henley brothers. Please send someone to get him. A pause. Mrs. Granger appeared in the kitchen doorway, took one look at Eleanor's face, and turned back without a word to send the stable boy. Eleanor went back to the desk. She read the letter a third time. Calloway had found the sale. Not a pending sale. Not a negotiation in process. A completed transaction filed with the county recorder's office 4 days ago. The Whitmore estate, the house, the land, the outbuildings, the timber rights on the north 40 acres had been sold to a man named Gerald Forsyth of Philadelphia for the sum of $42,000. The deed was signed. The recording was complete. The transaction on its face was entirely legal. Margaret had moved in days, not weeks. She had been ready. She had been waiting for the signal that someone was looking, and she had treated that signal not as a warning to stop, but as a starting pistol. Eleanor set the letter down. She thought about her father's study, the window that faced the garden, the desk where he had taught her to read a balance sheet at the age of 12, sitting her on a stool beside his chair and explaining each column with the patient precision of a man who understood that knowledge given directly was worth more than money left behind, the shelf where he kept his journals, the chair by the fire where he read in the evenings. $42,000. All of it. Gone. Filed and recorded and sold to a man in Philadelphia who had no idea what he had purchased alongside the land and the timber rights. She heard Caldwell's step on the front porch. The door. The hallway. He came into the study and looked at her, and she held the letter out without speaking. He took it. He read it. She watched his face do something she hadn't seen it do before, a brief controlled compression, like a man absorbing a blow he had been braced for, but that landed harder than expected anyway. He set the letter on the desk. 4 days ago, he said. She had it ready, Eleanor said. The moment she knew Calloway was pulling records she filed. She must have had Forsyth lined up for weeks, possibly since before she sent me here. This was always the plan, Caldwell said. Remove you, complete the sale. Once the property transfers to a good faith buyer, the fraud becomes a separate question from the remedy. Even if Harding proves the will was forged, recovering the estate itself from Forsyth requires proving he knew about the fraud, which he didn't know, Eleanor said. He bought a house in good faith, which means your remedy, even if the fraud is proven, becomes financial rather than physical. You could recover the value of the estate, not the estate. The room was quiet for a moment. Eleanor said, "How much of the $42,000 does Margaret actually have?" Caldwell looked at her. "What do you mean?" The sale price was $42,000. But Margaret has been drawing from the estate for 5 years, living expenses, the girls' clothing, their social appearances, the Richmond house upkeep. Whatever she paid Aldridge. Whatever she's paid to keep certain people from asking certain questions. Eleanor picked up her pencil. What is she actually holding right now? Caldwell was very still, watching her think. You're asking whether she can return the money, he said slowly. I'm asking whether she has it to return, Eleanor said. Because if the fraud is proven and the estate cannot be physically recovered, the court can order restitution. The question is whether there's anything left to restitute. She looked at him. If she's spent it, if the $42,000 has already been earmarked for debts, she's run up against the estate's expected value, then proving the fraud gets me a judgment against a woman who can't pay it. A judgment she can avoid by declaring insolvency. Yes. Caldwell sat down. They looked at each other across the desk. I need to see Margaret's financial records, Eleanor said. Not the estate records. Her personal accounts. What she's borrowed, what she's spent, what she owes. That is considerably harder to obtain than a county court filing. I know. Eleanor tapped the pencil against the desk once. But Calloway is in Richmond, and Richmond society is not large. And a woman who has been living at a standard that exceeds her actual income for 5 years will have left a trail. Caldwell looked at her for a long moment. You've been thinking about this since last night, he said. I've been thinking about this for 2 years, she said. Last night I finally had enough pieces to think about it usefully. He stood up. He crossed to the window, stood there for a moment with his back to her, and she watched him think the way she had learned to read his thinking. The set of his shoulders, the quality of his stillness, the specific tension in the line of his jaw that meant he was calculating rather than deciding, because the deciding came after. There's another angle, he said. She waited. Forsyth, he said. The buyer. He bought in good faith. He bought a property with a potential title defect, Caldwell said. He doesn't know that yet. But if someone were to inform him, not accusingly, not with any suggestion of wrongdoing on his part, simply to make him aware that the probate of the estate is under federal inquiry, and that the title may carry a defect that could affect his ownership. He turned from the window. A man who has paid $42,000 for a property does not want to discover afterward that the title is compromised. He will want that resolved, and the most direct way to resolve it is to cooperate with the inquiry. Eleanor understood immediately. If Forsyth cooperates with Harding, then Forsyth's solicitor will pull every document he received at closing, which will include everything Aldridge provided to certify the sale. Caldwell looked at her. And a buyer's solicitor examining those documents with fresh eyes and a specific question to answer is considerably more motivated than a county clerk who was told the matter was settled. Eleanor set the pencil down. We need to reach Forsyth before Margaret does, she said. Margaret doesn't know we've found the sale yet, Caldwell said. Calloway found it this morning. She'll know we've found it eventually, but she doesn't know today. Then today matters, Eleanor said. Yes, he said. It does. He picked up his coat. I'll ride to Richmond this afternoon, he said. Calloway can locate Forsyth's solicitor. I'll handle that conversation myself. He looked at her. You stay here. I know, she said before he could add the reasoning. If I'm in Richmond, Margaret's people will see me, and she'll know exactly what we're doing. That's half of it, he said. What's the other half? He paused at the door. Something moved across his face, not quite hesitation, something more considered than that. I don't want you anywhere near her, he said. Not until this is on record and Harding has it in hand. Whatever she does next, I don't want you standing in front of it alone. Eleanor looked at him. She had spent 4 years standing in front of things alone. She had become so accustomed to that particular posture, braced, self-sufficient, requiring nothing from anyone, that having someone speak about it directly, simply without sentiment, felt strange in a way she did not entirely have language for. I'll stay, she said. He nodded once. He left. She listened to his horse leave the yard. Then she picked up her pencil and went back to work, because the alternative was sitting with the image of her father's study being someone else's property, and she was not ready to sit with that yet. The second letter came that afternoon. Not from Calloway. Not from Harding. From Margaret. It was delivered by private courier, not the public post, a private man on a good horse, who handed the envelope to Mrs. Granger with instructions that it was for Miss Whitmore personally and required no response. Mrs. Granger brought it to the study with an expression that suggested she had her own opinions about private couriers and their employers. Eleanor looked at the handwriting on the envelope for a moment. Then she broke the seal. The letter was 2 pages. Eleanor read them carefully the way she had learned to read everything Margaret produced, not for what it said, but for the architecture underneath what it said, the load-bearing walls of intention hidden inside the decorative language. On the surface, an offer. Margaret was prepared, she wrote, to provide Eleanor with a settlement from the estate proceeds, a generous one. $5,000 placed in an account in Eleanor's name at a Richmond bank available to her immediately and unconditionally. All that was required was Eleanor's signed acknowledgement that her father's estate had been properly handled, that she had no contest to the probate proceedings, and that she considered the matter of her inheritance fully and finally resolved. $5,000 out of $42,000. Eleanor set the letter on the desk and looked at it. She thought about what $5,000 meant in practical terms. It meant independence. It meant a house, not a room in someone else's house. It meant years of security without dependence on anyone's goodwill. It meant the end of a fight that had been wearing her down for 2 years in ways she only fully felt in the hours before sleep, when there was nothing left to do, and the weight of it had nowhere to go but inward. She sat with that for exactly as long as she permitted herself to sit with it. Then she picked up her pencil. She turned the letter over to its blank backside. She wrote, "No." She folded it. She addressed it to Margaret Holloway in Richmond. She brought it to Mrs. Granger. "Please see that this goes with the next post," she said. Mrs. Granger took it. She looked at Eleanor's face. "Child," she said, which was the second time she had used that word, and Eleanor had come to understand that Mrs. Granger used it specifically when she meant something more than what the word itself contained. "Are you certain?" "She offered 5,000, Eleanor said. "Out of 42. My father's estate was worth 60. She paused. "He wrote a will 6 weeks before he died that said all of it was mine. If I sign that acknowledgement, I'm saying his wishes didn't matter. I'm saying what she did to his intentions was acceptable." She looked at Mrs. Granger. "I can't sign that. Not for 5,000. Not for the full 60. Mrs. Granger looked at her for a long moment. "No," she said finally. "I don't reckon you can." She took the letter and left. Caldwell came back late that night after Eleanor had stopped pretending she wasn't listening for his horse and had simply moved her chair to face the window. She heard the yard. She heard the door. She went into the hallway. He looked tired in a way she hadn't seen before, not physically. Something deeper. The fatigue of a man who has spent a day navigating human dishonesty and finds it genuinely wearing even when he has experience of it. "Forsyth's solicitor," he said without preamble. "His name is Baird. He's thorough, and he's been practicing for 20 years, and the moment I laid the question in front of him, the potential title defect, the federal inquiry, the question about the probate, he went white. He hadn't looked closely at the probate documents, Eleanor said. I examined them at closing, but not with any reason to suspect them. A filed and recorded will is a filed and recorded will. Caldwell came into the study and sat down heavily. He's looking at them now. He pulled everything from his files before I left his office. He'll have his own analysis by Thursday. Will Forsyth cooperate with Harding? Baird will recommend it strongly. A buyer who cooperates with a fraud inquiry is a victim. A buyer who doesn't cooperate is a complication. He looked at her. Baird will make that distinction very clear to his client. Eleanor nodded. She slid the copy she'd made of Margaret's letter across the desk. Caldwell read it. His expression went through something. She offered you $5,000, he said. And my signed acknowledgement that everything was properly handled, which would have closed the inquiry. Which was the point? Eleanor looked at him steadily. I sent her a one-word answer. He looked at her. She's going to respond to that, he said. Not with another letter. I know. Eleanor. That use of her name again, the same quality as before, the same slight shift outside the professional register they maintained. When she responds, and she will within days, it won't be a settlement offer. You've refused the settlement. You've refused twice counting the first day. She has nothing left to offer, and she knows it. He paused. What she has left is damage. She will try to do enough damage to your reputation, to this situation, to my involvement in it, that the inquiry becomes too costly to pursue. She's been trying to damage my reputation since she walked into my father's house, Eleanor said. This will be different from the letters she sent to Richmond drawing rooms, Caldwell said. This will be deliberate, and it will be public, and it will be aimed specifically at anything she thinks you value. He looked at her. She'll come here. Let her come, Eleanor said. I mean, she'll come with witnesses. People from Richmond society. She'll want an audience for whatever she does next, because an audience makes it a story, and a story is harder to counter than a fact. Eleanor looked at the window. She thought about Margaret's face on the first morning at the top of the staircase. Hands folded, chin lifted, that patient and unwearying smile. She thought about 14 miles of summer road and a sealed letter and the specific weight of a thing that has been a long time coming. Then we'll have an audience too, Eleanor said. It took Margaret 4 days. 4 days during which Harding's office sent word that the Alexandria shipping audit had confirmed Pearson's fraud. The secondary ledger found exactly where Eleanor had predicted, documenting 31 months of systematic theft, totaling $4,240. Pearson had been quietly detained and his accounts frozen. That news had come in a short official letter that Caldwell had read aloud to Eleanor over breakfast, with a tone that did not celebrate, but carried the particular satisfaction of a man who has been correct about something he wished he'd been wrong about. 4 days during which Baird's analysis confirmed the title defect in the Whitmore estate deed, and Forsyth formally requested to be included in Harding's inquiry as a cooperating party rather than a subject. 4 days, during which Calloway located in Margaret's personal financial records, obtained through her bank, with Harding's federal authority evidence, that she had borrowed heavily against the expected estate sale proceeds, that the debts were substantial and due, and that the $42,000 from Forsyth had already been allocated almost entirely to creditors, leaving Margaret, after 5 years of spending against an estate she had stolen, with less than $3,000 to her name. She had nothing left but momentum. She came on a Friday morning. Eleanor heard the carriages, 2 of them before Mrs. Granger appeared in the study doorway, with her arms folded and her expression set to the specific configuration it wore when she had already made up her mind about something and was waiting for instruction to act on it. She's brought people, Mrs. Granger said. I count 6. 3 women from Richmond society, I believe. A man I don't recognize, and Aldridge. Eleanor set her pencil down. She brought her solicitor, she said. He has a document case under his arm. Eleanor stood up. She smoothed her dress. She was wearing the better of her 2 plain dresses, which was not much better than the other one, and she was aware of that, and aware that Margaret would be dressed immaculately, and had brought witnesses for precisely the visual contrast, and she set all of that aside, because what she was wearing was not the argument she intended to make. Where is Mr. Caldwell? She said. Eastfield. I've already sent Tommy. Good. Eleanor looked at Mrs. Granger. "Show them into the front parlor. All of them. Don't separate anyone. And when Mr. Caldwell arrives, bring him directly in." Mrs. Granger looked at her steadily. "You know what she's come to do," she said. "Yes. And you're ready." Eleanor picked up the folder from the corner of the desk. The estate folder, 11 pages grown now to 40, with Prescott's letter, and Calloway's analysis, and Harding's correspondence, and Thomas Calder's note, all filed in careful order inside it. "I've been ready for 2 years," she said. "I just didn't have anywhere to stand." She walked out of the study and down the hall to the parlor. Margaret was in the center of the room, which was where she always positioned herself, not near the window, not near the door in the center, so that anyone entering had to orient themselves around her rather than the other way. She had brought precisely the audience she had intended, 3 women who between them touched most of Richmond's active social circles. A man Eleanor recognized after a moment as a correspondent for one of the Richmond papers, and Aldridge, who was shorter than she'd imagined, and whose eyes moved to the folder under her arm immediately and stayed there. "Eleanor," Margaret said, warmly, "I'm so glad you're here. I was worried when I received your note that there might have been some misunderstanding between us." "There's no misunderstanding," Eleanor said. "Please sit down." She said it the way Caldwell had said it to her on the first day, the same deliberateness, the same clarity of intent. Margaret's eyes sharpened slightly, recognizing the register, and Eleanor watched her decide in real time to remain standing. "I've come," Margaret said, turning slightly toward the 3 women, including them, making this a group conversation rather than a private one. "Because I'm concerned about Eleanor's situation here. A young woman alone in a man's house without proper supervision in circumstances that, even if innocent, and I'm certain they are, create an appearance that will follow her. I feel responsible. She is my stepdaughter." "Your stepdaughter," Eleanor said, "who you sent here with a pre-written letter designed to destroy her reputation, distributed to Richmond's post office before her carriage left your driveway." A brief, practiced look of wounded surprise from Margaret. "I wrote privately." "You wrote to 17 recipients," Eleanor said. "That number is documented. Calloway confirmed it through the postmaster's records." She looked at the 3 women. "She timed the distribution so the story would reach this county before I did, so that any account I gave of my own situation would already be contradicted by the version she'd written." One of the women, older with the face of someone who has been in enough parlors to know when a performance is being given, looked at Margaret. Margaret's composure held, but it held the way things hold under pressure, visibly with effort. "You've been spending time with lawyers," Margaret said, "and it shows. But Eleanor, dear, whatever this man has told you about your father's estate." "My father wrote a will 6 weeks before he died," Eleanor said. "His solicitor, a man named Prescott in Fredericksburg, prepared it, witnessed it, and has retained a signed copy for 5 years. That will names me as the sole beneficiary. It supersedes every prior document by date and by your own husband's stated intention." She opened the folder. She removed Prescott's letter and held it up. "This is a letter from Prescott confirming the existence of that document and his willingness to produce it under oath." Aldridge's hand tightened on his document case. Eleanor saw it. "The will you filed," she said, looking directly at him for the first time, "was an earlier document with a replaced final page, the page that distributes the estate assets. It was replaced, and my father's mark on that final page does not match 14 other authenticated samples of his handwriting obtained from his bank records." She removed Calloway's analysis. "This is a legal analysis confirming that discrepancy." The room was completely still. The newspaper man had stopped pretending he wasn't writing. Margaret said, very controlled, "You have no standing." "I have 4 months," Eleanor said. "The probate contest window is 5 years from the date of filing. I have 4 months remaining, and I have a federal judge actively inquiring into the filing." She removed Harding's correspondence. "This is Judge Harding's confirmation of his authority and the scope of his current inquiry, which includes both the Whitmore estate probate and the conduct of the solicitor who filed it." Aldridge took a step backward. It was a small step, but everyone in the room saw it. "You sold my father's house," Eleanor said, turning back to Margaret. Her voice was level. She had promised herself it would stay level, and it did, because level was more devastating than anything else available to her right now. To a man named Forsyth, for $42,000, 4 days after you learned someone was examining the probate records. Forsyth is cooperating with the federal inquiry as a good-faith buyer with a compromised title. His solicitor has already confirmed the title defect. She removed that letter. And your personal financial records obtained under federal authority confirm that the sale proceeds have been allocated to debts run against the estate's anticipated value debts you incurred across 5 years of managing an estate that was not legally yours to manage. Margaret looked at her. Not with the patient certain expression of a woman who holds more cards. With the specific controlled expression of a woman who is recounting what she has left and coming up short. You have nothing, Eleanor said quietly. Just to her, not for the room. You have $3,000 and a house in Richmond that's mortgaged against proceeds you no longer have. You have a solicitor who just took a step backward in a room full of witnesses. You have 2 daughters whose future depends on whether this inquiry concludes with a negotiated restitution or a criminal referral. She paused. I am offering you the first option. Not because I forgive you, but because my father would have, and I am trying to be the person he raised. The room breathed. The door opened. Caldwell came in still in his riding coat and stood at the back of the room without speaking. He looked at Eleanor. She looked at him. He gave her the smallest nod she had ever seen, barely a movement, barely anything at all, and she turned back to Margaret. You sent me here to disappear, Eleanor said. You needed me out of Richmond while you finalized a sale you knew I could contest. You dressed it up as concern and consequence and social propriety, and you distributed that story before I had a chance to tell my own. She looked at the 3 women, at the newspaper man at Aldridge, at the man she didn't recognize. I'm telling it now, in front of whoever you brought to witness my humiliation. She looked back at Margaret. I hope they find it instructive. Margaret stood very still. Then, and Eleanor would remember this moment for a long time, would turn it over in later years. The way you turn over a stone to see what's underneath something, in Margaret's face changed. Not remorse, not guilt. Something more complicated than either. The specific expression of a woman who has operated for years on the belief that the people she underestimated would stay underestimated, confronting the evidence that she was wrong. What do you want? Margaret said, very quietly. Just the 2 of them inside the larger room. A signed acknowledgement, Eleanor said, that the will filed by Aldridge was not the final expression of my father's wishes. That Prescott's document represents his true intentions. That you will not contest the inquiry and will cooperate with Harding's office in recovering whatever portion of the estate value remains. She paused. In exchange, I will not pursue a criminal referral for fraud. You will keep the Richmond house and the $3,000. You and the girls will have somewhere to live and something to live on. And if I don't sign? Then Harding completes the inquiry without a cooperation agreement, Eleanor said, and the criminal referral goes to the federal court. And Aldridge answers for filing a fraudulent document under his bar license. She looked at the solicitor, which I imagine he would find considerably more inconvenient than a civil settlement. Aldridge opened his document case. He removed a pen. He looked at Margaret. Something passed between them. The specific communication of 2 people who have been in business together and are now calculating separately and simultaneously how much of that business they are willing to own in front of a federal judge. Margaret looked at Eleanor. You're your father's daughter, she said. It was not entirely a compliment. It was not entirely not one. Yes, Eleanor said. I am. Margaret sat down. Aldridge produced a document. A blank one, his own firm's paper. Eleanor noticed, which meant he had known this might end in a signed agreement and had come prepared for it, which told her something about how much Aldridge trusted Margaret's position going into this room. Write it, Eleanor said. In plain language, every point I named. Aldridge wrote. The room watched. The newspaper man was definitely writing. Eleanor stood in the center of the parlor, the center where Margaret had positioned herself when she arrived, and held her father's folder in both hands and breathed slow and even. The way she breathed when she was working through something complicated and needed to stay sharp. Caldwell was still at the back of the room. She didn't look at him. She didn't need to. She knew he was there. She realized a thing she had not known before, and was only now understanding the full weight of knowing that someone was there. Not managing for them, not despite them, not around them. Simply knowing that when she turned around, he would be standing where he said he would stand. It was a quieter thing than she'd expected love to be when it arrived. She kept her eyes forward. Aldridge finished writing. He turned the document toward Margaret. Margaret picked up the pen. She signed. Margaret's signature dried on the paper at 10:30 on a Friday morning, and the room emptied. The way rooms empty after something irreversible has happened not all at once, but in the particular gradual way of people who came expecting one kind of story and received another and need a moment to adjust to the new version. Aldridge left first. He packed his document case with the careful movements of a man concentrating very hard on not appearing to hurry, and he did not look at Eleanor on his way out, which told her everything she needed to know about what he understood his own exposure to be. The three women from Richmond followed, and Eleanor noticed that two of them did not meet Margaret's eyes as they passed her, which was its own kind of verdict. The newspaper man left last, and he did look at Eleanor directly with the specific attention of a person who has just witnessed something he intends to describe accurately, and gave her a brief single nod before he went. The man Eleanor hadn't recognized left without speaking to anyone. She still didn't know who he was. She decided it didn't matter. What remained in the parlor was Margaret still seated, and Caldwell at the back of the room, and Mrs. Granger in the doorway, with her arms folded, and Eleanor standing in the center with the signed document in her hand. Margaret looked at her hands in her lap for a moment. Then she looked up. "Your father," she said, "would have found a way to be generous about this." "I know," Eleanor said. "That's why I gave you the Richmond house." Something crossed Margaret's face. Not gratitude. Too complicated for gratitude. The specific expression of a woman encountering grace from someone she has no right to expect it from and not entirely knowing what to do with it. "Clara and Bess," Margaret said. "They had no part in this." "I know that too," Eleanor said. "Whatever happens with the inquiry, the arrangement I offered stands. The house and the $3,000 are theirs as much as yours. Make certain they understand that." Margaret stood up. She straightened her coat. She lifted her chin to its habitual angle. And then she did something Eleanor had never seen her do in 4 years. She looked at Eleanor without calculation in her eyes. Just looked. Like a woman seeing another woman clearly for the first time, without the lens of what she stood to gain or lose. "I underestimated you," Margaret said. Quiet, simple, not an apology, just a fact. "Yes," Eleanor said. "You did." Margaret walked out. Mrs. Granger stepped aside to let her pass, then looked at Eleanor with an expression that was more than satisfaction and less than joy. The deep settled look of a woman who has seen the right thing happen and intends to remember it. "I'll put the kettle on," Mrs. Granger said, and disappeared toward the kitchen. Eleanor stood in the empty parlor. She was still holding the signed document. She heard Caldwell cross the room. He stopped beside her, not in front of her. Beside her, the way he had stood beside her, through all of it, never between her and what she needed to face, and looked at the paper in her hands. "It's not over," he said. "Harding still has to complete the inquiry. Forsyth's title defect has to be formally resolved. There's a great deal of legal work between here and done." "I know," Eleanor said, "but the worst of it is behind you." She looked at the document, at Margaret's signature, at the plain, irrefutable fact of it. "She signed it," Eleanor said. "She signed it. In front of witnesses." "In front of a newspaper man," Caldwell said. "Which is better than witnesses." Eleanor almost smiled. The almost was very close to the real thing. "My father's will," she said. "Even if the estate itself can't be fully recovered, even if Forsyth keeps the property, and I receive financial restitution. Instead, his wishes are on record. What he intended is on record. Nobody can say anymore that he didn't care what happened to me." She paused. "That matters more than the money. It always did." Caldwell said nothing for a moment. Then, "Come and have some coffee." She looked at him. "That's all you have to say. You just won a 2-year fight in a room full of your enemy's witnesses, using nothing but documents and the truth," he said. "I think coffee is appropriate. Possibly something stronger, but Mrs. Granger runs a temperate house." This time, Eleanor did smile. The real thing. They went to have coffee. Harding's formal findings arrived 3 weeks later. 3 weeks during which Eleanor had moved back into a version of ordinary life at the Caldwell estate, working mornings on the account books, which were now almost entirely reconstructed, and clean working afternoons on the correspondence with Calloway and Harding's office, and spending evenings in the increasingly frequent habit of sitting with Caldwell in the study after supper, while he read and she worked, and neither of them felt any particular need to fill the silence with anything other than what it already held. She had noticed this shift the way she noticed most things, carefully without announcing it, turning it over in her mind during the quiet moments to examine what it actually was. It was not gratitude on his part. She was fairly certain of that. Caldwell was not a man who confused professional respect with personal feeling, or personal feeling with obligation. She had watched him be scrupulously careful about the line between them for weeks, maintaining it not with coldness, but with the particular consideration of a man who understands that a woman in her position has no room to navigate anything unclear. It was not dependency on hers. She was certain of that. She had spent too long being dependent on people's tolerance of her presence to mistake this for that. She felt in this house the specific and unfamiliar freedom of a person whose presence is chosen rather than accommodated. She did not need to be small here. She did not need to take up less space. She could work hard and speak plainly and be exactly as capable as she actually was, and none of that required apology. She had wondered some mornings whether she was imagining the rest of it. Then Harding's letter arrived and she stopped wondering about anything else for a while. The inquiry was complete. The findings were unambiguous. The will filed by Aldridge had been examined by 3 independent document experts retained by Harding's office, all of whom confirmed Calloway's analysis. The final page was inconsistent with the rest of the document in paperweight, ink composition, and signature characteristics. Prescott's will was authenticated. Aldridge had been referred to the Virginia Bar for professional conduct proceedings. The county clerk who had told Prescott his inquiry was unnecessary had been identified as a man with a documented financial relationship with Aldridge's firm. Forsyth's title defect was formally recorded. Forsyth, acting on Baird's strong recommendation, had agreed to a negotiated resolution. He would retain the property, but compensate Eleanor for the full appraised value at the time of her father's death. $60,000, not $42,000, with the difference to be recovered from Margaret's assets under the restitution order. Margaret, with $3,000 and a mortgaged house, could not pay $60,000. Harding's order specified a payment schedule. A long one. It would be years before Eleanor saw the full sum. She didn't care. She sat at the desk in the study and read Harding's letter 3 times, and then set it down and looked at the ceiling and breathed. $60,000, not the house. She had accepted that the house was gone, and she had made her peace with it in the way she made peace with most things, by deciding what it meant and what it didn't mean, and then moving forward. Forsyth had bought a house. That house was his. Her father's study, his window, his garden. Those existed now in her memory and in the 11 pages she had written the first night, and she would keep them there. But the $60,000 was the record. The record that said Thomas Whitmore knew what he was doing. He made his wishes clear. His daughter was worth protecting, and he protected her, and the law slowly, imperfectly, with considerable effort from everyone involved, had finally confirmed it. She heard Caldwell's step in the hall. She picked up the letter and held it out when he appeared in the doorway. He read it standing up the way he always read things that mattered. He set it on the desk. He looked at her. $60,000, he said. Over time, she said. Years, probably. Still, she agreed. He sat down across from her. He looked at the letter, then at her, then at some middle distance that she had come to recognize as where he went when he was deciding something. "What will you do?" he said. She had been thinking about this since the morning Harding's letter arrived, and she had an answer, a clear one built in the same methodical way she built everything, but she wanted to hear what he asked first before she gave it. "What do you mean?" she said. "You have a settlement coming. Financial independence. You could go anywhere." He paused. "Richmond if you wanted, or north. Philadelphia, Boston. A woman with $60,000 and your abilities has considerable options." "You're asking if I'm leaving," she said. He looked at her directly. "Yes." The word sat between them with more weight than a single syllable usually carried. Eleanor looked at his desk. At the account books stacked in their proper order on the left side, clean now, every discrepancy resolved, the Pearson fraud documented, and the shipping interest rerouted through a new manager that she had vetted herself. At the tenant dispute folder on the right, resolved 2 weeks ago. The Henley boundary clarified in language she had drafted, and Caldwell had approved, and both families had signed without objection. At the correspondence files in the center, Harding, Calloway, Prescott, Baird. The careful accumulation of a fight that had started with 11 pages written by candlelight and ended with a federal judge's signature. She had built something here, not just resolved something, built something. "I'm not leaving," she said. He was very still. "Eleanor," he said, "I want to be careful with this. You have been in a position of significant dependency, and I don't want you to feel that." "I know what you're doing," she said. "You're being careful. You've been being careful for 6 weeks, which I noticed and appreciated, because you're right that a woman in my position has no room to navigate anything unclear." She looked at him. "But my position is different now than it was when I arrived. I have a settlement. I have a professional record that Calloway says is remarkable, and that Harding's office is apparently aware of. I have options." She paused. "I'm not staying because I have nowhere else to go. I'm staying because this is where I want to be." The room was very quiet. "Tell me plainly," he said. "So that I'm not—" He stopped. Tried again. The particular difficulty of a man who has spent 6 years keeping his own counsel encountering something he cannot counsel himself through alone. "I am not a man who finds this kind of conversation easy." "I know," she said. "Tell me anyway." He looked at her. "I have not had anyone in this house," he said slowly, "who made it feel like a place worth coming home to. Since in a long time, possibly ever." He paused. "I find that I would like you to stay. Not as an employee, not out of obligation or gratitude or any of the things that should not be the foundation of—" Another pause. "I find that I would like you to stay because this house is better with you in it, and because you are the most honest person I have met in my adult life, and because I have spent 6 weeks being very careful, and I am finding that careful is becoming insufficient." Eleanor looked at him for a long moment. She thought about the first day, the carriage door, the 14 miles, the sealed letter pressed flat against her chest, the front step and the 47 seconds and the door opening. She thought about a chair pulled toward a window in a stranger's study and the specific incomprehensible kindness of being told to sit down. She thought about everything that had been built in the 6 weeks since. Not just the legal case, not just the account books, but the thing underneath all of it. The thing she had been examining in the quiet hours with the same careful attention she gave to balance sheets and document comparisons and patterns that were too consistent to be accidental. "Nathaniel," she said. She had not used his given name before. She watched him register it the way she had registered it when he used hers, the small, precise shift of something that matters. "Yes," he said. "I walked into your house because someone wanted to destroy me," she said. "And you gave me a chair. And then you gave me work. And then you gave me a federal judge and an attorney contact and 6 weeks of sitting in the same room while I rebuilt my entire life from 11 pages of notes." She paused. "You didn't rescue me. I want to be clear about that. Everything I won in this house, I won." "You did," he said, without hesitation. "But you gave me somewhere to stand," she said. "I hadn't had that in 4 years, possibly longer." She held his gaze. "That is not something I'm willing to walk away from. Not for Philadelphia, not for Boston, not for $60,000. Caldwell looked at her with the same expression she had cataloged across 6 weeks. The measuring look, the assessing look, the look that preceded his most considered statements, and she waited because she had learned that his silences meant something and deserved patience. "Then stay," he said. "I intend to," she said. He reached across the desk. He put his hand over hers, not dramatically, not with any of the theatrical weight that novels gave to such moments, but with the simple, deliberate quality of a man who has decided something and is communicating it through the only gesture available to him that wasn't words. She turned her hand over. They stayed like that for a moment in the quiet study in the Virginia summer. Then Eleanor said, "The Henley South boundary still needs a permanent marker before the fall." Caldwell almost laughed. She heard it in his voice when he said it does. "And your Alexandria shipping account needs a new quarterly review process. I have a format in mind." "Of course you do." And Calloway mentioned there are 2 other estates in the county with similar probate irregularities that Harding's office flagged during the inquiry. He asked if I'd be willing to consult. Caldwell looked at her. "He asked you directly." He said. She found the letter on the corner of the desk. He said, and I'm reading this exactly, "Miss Whitmore's approach to document analysis is the most methodical I have encountered in 30 years of practice, and I would be a fool not to ask." A pause. "Calloway," Caldwell said, "has good judgment." "He does," Eleanor agreed. She set the letter down. "I told him I'd consider it, depending on what else I had on my desk." "And what do you have on your desk?" She looked at the account books, the correspondence files, the tenant folder, the 11 pages that had become 40, that had become the record of a thing that started as an act of malice and ended as the proof that one honest man's intentions written down carefully. 6 weeks before he died, could survive 5 years of deliberate suppression and still arrive exactly where they were meant to go. "Quite a lot," she said. "As it turns out." They were married in September in a small church 12 miles from the estate on a morning that was cooler than July had been and smelled like the particular combination of harvest and coming autumn that Eleanor had always associated for reasons she could not entirely explain, with the feeling that things were as they should be. Mrs. Granger cried. She denied this afterward with considerable conviction, but Eleanor had seen it, and Mrs. Granger knew Eleanor had seen it, and they maintained a comfortable and mutual agreement never to discuss it. Calloway attended. Prescott was too old to travel, but sent a letter that Eleanor read at the breakfast table, and then folded carefully into her father's journal in the blank pages at the back that she had been slowly filling for 6 weeks. Thomas Calder the younger came with his father, who shook Eleanor's hand with both of his and said in the direct way of a man who has spent 30 years dealing in small, precise truths, "Your father would be very pleased." She believed him. Harding sent a formal note of congratulations that was probably the least romantic document she had ever read, and was therefore coming from a federal judge exactly right. There was no one from Richmond society. Eleanor had not invited anyone from Richmond society, and this had required no deliberation whatsoever. After the church they came home, not to a reception or a gathering, or any of the elaborate social architecture that Virginia's upper class built around its important occasions. They came home to the working house with its plain wood and clean windows, and the east field visible from the study, and Mrs. Granger had made a meal that was considerably better than the cold chicken and cornbread of Eleanor's first evening, and they ate it at the kitchen table because Eleanor had never been comfortable with formal dining rooms, and Caldwell had no attachment to them whatsoever. At some point during the meal, Eleanor reached into her dress pocket and took out the original sealed letter. The one she had carried 14 miles. The one Margaret had written and distributed before Eleanor's carriage had traveled the first mile marker. She set it on the table. Caldwell looked at it. "You kept it," he said. "I kept it," she said. "Why?" She looked at it. At the red wax seal broken now curled at the edge. Margaret's family crest facing up. "Because it's the beginning of the story," she said. "And I didn't want to forget what it felt like to be handed a punishment dressed up as an opportunity. Not because I want to stay angry about it, but because the day I forget how that felt is the day I stop understanding why it matters that it ended differently." Caldwell looked at the letter. "What do you want to do with it?" he said. Eleanor picked it up. She looked at it for a long moment. Then she handed it to him. "Put it in the fire," she said. "I don't need it anymore." He took it. He stood. He crossed to the kitchen hearth and placed the letter in the fire, and they both watched it take the corner first, then the wax seal, then Margaret's careful handwriting, curling into nothing. The red crest, the last thing to go, and then that too, and then only heat and light, where the whole elaborate architecture of someone else's malice had been. Eleanor watched it until it was gone. Then she turned back to the table. Outside, the Virginia autumn was settling in over the fields, the first honest cool after months of summer heat, the kind of air that made everything feel possible and finite and real all at once. The estate was quiet in the particular way of working places at the end of a working day, when the men have gone in and the animals are settled and the land holds what it holds without anyone needing to tell it what to do. This was her home now, not recovered, not restored, not given back to her. She had never liked, that framing had always felt, it gave too much to the circumstances and too little to the work. She had built this, from 11 pages and a sealed letter, and the decision not to burn it over a fireplace in Margaret Holloway's dining room. She had built exactly this, a table and a meal, and a man who had offered her a chair before he said a word, and the absolute irreversible fact that no one in the world could hand her a punishment, dressed as an opportunity ever again, because she had run out of things for anyone to take. Caldwell sat back down across from her. He looked at her the way he had looked at her across that same desk on the first morning. The measuring look, the honest look, the look that had seen her clearly before she had said a single word about who she was. "The Henley marker," he said. "Monday," she said. "Calloway's estates. I wrote him this morning. I said yes." He nodded. He picked up his fork. "Good," he said. "Eleanor Whitmore. Eleanor Caldwell. Now though she thought of herself as both, because you did not give up the name that was your father's, and your fights just because you had added another, picked up her fork and ate her supper in her own house on her own land, beside a man who had never once in 6 weeks or 6 months or any of the years that followed needed her to be anything other than exactly who she was. Margaret Holloway had sent her here to disappear. She had arrived instead, and she intended to stay,